speak very quickly, and I have a lot of slides to go through in a very short amount of time. If you haven't seen me present before, it's sort of my style. It works for the way I like to impart information, and I'm still hoping there's a little bit of time at the end for some conversation/questions. So let's just begin. So this is what journalists can learn from game design, and I'd argue potentially that it's what everyone can learn from game design. And that's not quite as arrogant as it may sound. I'm explicitly just thinking that a lot of these activities that we learn within game design are actually applicable to a wide variety of audiences. And you'll understand the context in a second. But basically, we're talking about engagement. And so this is basically advice that we share with and collected from a variety of media partners and leaders from organizations like these. So these are people who come to us, or we've gone to them and said, hey, we've got some ideas, what do you think of it? And they all center around games in particular. And so I need to set some context for you first. And the first bit of context I'd like to set for you is who I am. So you may be asking yourself, who is this guy talking about games? So I've been making games since 5 1/4 diskettes were popular. And some of you may have never even seen them. I've been teaching games and interactive media for more than 12 years. It's actually 13 years this year. And I've directed 2 top games programs in the US, one at Miami University and the current one I direct at American University. I've written more than 50 articles and other things, book chapters, papers, etc., on games and game design since about 2009. And I've designed and developed scores of independent games at this point. I'm also the vice president of an organization called the Global Game Jam. The Global Game Jam is a nonprofit, and we do one particular activity every year. We basically get more than 6,000 people to make games over a single weekend. That involves 93 countries and more than 600 locations. And the idea is really to empower people to understand how accessible game implementation, particularly digital game implementation, but also analog games, how accessible that is. And so this is just to help you understand that we are interested in games that are approaching the pace of news. I'm not going to make any promises that we can produce games as quickly as news is released, but we're moving in that direction. Now, I'll also tell you that while I've worked with the news, I am distinctly not a journalist. So I may say some things that journalists would say, well, I don't know if that's true. Just a preface. I am, however, the director of American University's Game Lab and Studio, and our focus of the Game Lab and Studio is to apply game design to non-game contexts. So basically, we're interested in engagement through play. That's the focus of the program, that's the focus of our studio. And on the studio end, I run the game studio, which has collected more than $500,000 US domestic in game contracts and funding since 2014. And one of the more interesting and germane research initiatives that we have is something called JOLT, which roughly stands for Journalism, Leadership, and Transformation. And so the idea behind JOLT is that we received a very generous gift from the Knight Foundation, a $250,000 gift from the Knight Foundation, to understand how we can innovate journalism through game design. So our goal is really to seed innovation in journalism through game design thinking. And we have a really great team. We've got Jeff Rutenbeck, our dean, Amy Eisman, who is in the ONA community, so you may know her rather well, who's been active in ONA for years, and 3 fellows who include a video editor from Al Jazeera, a clinical psychologist, and a person who helped start Symbolia, a graphic novel news startup. We also have a team of 5 wonderful professional fellows. These are people who practice in the industry, including Maggie Farley, former LA Times correspondent, Tori Hargrove, who's now at Facebook, Matt Thompson, who's deputy editor of The Atlantic, Bob Hone, who's former creative director of Red Hill Game Studios, and Mitch Gelman, vice president of product at Gannett Digital. So that's all to let you know. We had lots of smart people contributing to this. This isn't just me sort of saying what I think is true. We've actually gotten a lot of good feedback on it. So the question is always games. And people have that big question mark around it. And when I say games, people start conjuring images of Scrabble, where when they think of games, they think of reminiscent designs like Connect 4, or they expect me to talk about Pong, or they expect to see some Pac-Man slide, so there's your requisite Pac-Man slide, and your requisite Mario slide. Or they have questions, and they're perhaps thinking of their favorite team playing something like Halo. If you're more news-oriented, you might remember that there's even a chance you're thinking about the nearly 100-year history of crossword puzzles in the news, newspapers in particular. Or you might be thinking of news games, and there are a variety of them that have been released over the last couple of years in the digital space. But what I'd like to start with, and I think is often helpful, is actually to give you a little info about the games industry itself. So this is where I get to impress you with big numbers. So the first is that 1.2 billion digital game players exist in the world. This is an estimate by TNS Global. And this is where I get to point out that that's a lot of people. This is also where I get to point out that 60 to 87% of populations in Western civilizations have an active playing community. So by country, you can see an illustration here. And the US dominates that a little bit, but there's still very large populations of game players all over Europe. And I can talk about the $100 billion industry itself, as Gartner estimates, or emphasize that gamers aren't just children, and that the average game player, according to the Electronic Software Association, is 31. Or I could assuage any concerns about gender divide in particular, by showing you that 47% to 52% female-male ratio in game players exists, and that's from the Electronic Software Association, which they tout annually. I could also emphasize that it's a steady growth industry. It's not that we're in the middle of a first-year boom and it's over next year. We've been growing steadily for years. What I like to do in this context is actually talk about what games and news have in common. So I'm going to start there. First, I love this graphic that demonstrates basically how much time people spend on specific activities within their mobile games, or within their mobile devices. And so playing games is at the top. And when you look at it, this is reported by Wired Magazine, what you'll see is that people spend about 60% of their time on mobile devices playing games. And then you'll notice that that lowest bar, the bottom, is the time they spend on news, at about 4%. But what's really interesting here, and we know that somewhere in here is where we want to address the issue, but somewhere in here there's a 60% time spent versus 4% time spent. And what you'll notice is that the reach, the audience size, is actually pretty much on par between games and news. And so what we'd like to do is bring those two in concert. And that's the red bar there, which indicates reach. So, it's interesting also to note that more people have cell phones than toilets, according to the UN, which I think is really interesting when you think about how pervasive the technology is. So all that is to help you understand that people spend lots of time playing games. And the question we want to address is how we can actually get those people spending lots of time with the news. Producing it, reading it, engaging with it. And we think the reality is that it's engagement, right? Games have great engagement. People spend hours and hours playing games. So we want to try and unearth the specifics about how games work to engage. And so one of the things that I really believe is that it turns out that right now the world has plenty of content. There is lots and lots of content in the world. And I'm not going to say that all the content is good, but there is lots of content. And the question that we keep hearing over and over again is, what makes your content special? And we'd argue that what makes your content special is actually experience. So really the idea is that if we look at the future, the digital future, what we know is that we have plenty of information, but we lack strategies for keeping people informed. And keeping people informed is really a product of being repeatedly engaged, coming back for more. And so the idea here is that it's not that good content is enough. Good content is not enough. We instead champion something we call engagement design. And engagement design itself is informed by game design. No surprise there, right? So I'm going to give you several lessons learned about engagement design. And there's only 4, so it should be easy to collect for those of you who are taking pictures. So there's a chance to take a picture now. I feel bad. I know it goes so quickly sometimes people are like, oh, I can't get my picture. All right, so lesson 1 is that content may be king, but experience is the kingdom. And I've said this repeatedly before, and I'm going to unearth it and explain it a little better than some of the shorter presentations that we've had before. So game designers are explicitly experienced designers. That's what game designers do. They design experience. And we help our players do. That's the focus of games. What did I do in my game? And so whether it's fostering community through party games like Johann Sebastian Joust, which is depicted here, which works beautifully to get audiences and players involved and to invite new players in. It's a great party game and people just sort of swing in and out of the game and participate pretty easily. Or games like Make and Money, which you may be familiar with. Basically, it's a game designed to create dialogue amongst varied community members in Macon, Georgia, in the United States. And basically, the way the game works is that players collect bonds. They must find the other person with the matching half of the bond that they are seeking. And then they discuss activities about their community. And what's interesting, this is another Knight-founded project. What's interesting here is that they did find that it actually engaged residents and really created new connections. So it was a great way to facilitate community members engaging in some of the challenges that face their community. So this is evidence of something we've known about games for a long time, which is that games are also quite useful for finding new solutions. So if we look at games like Evoke, which is a Jane McGonigal game launched many years ago at this point in Africa, the idea is that it's a kind of role-playing game combined with graphic novel. So it rewards people for finding solutions to urgent community needs by enabling them to do 3 key things. And the 3 key things you do in Evoke are learn, imagine, and act. That's what Evoke is about. These are the things you do in this game. And it proved to be fairly effective. So we know that games engage. And if you need evidence of that, here's a very simple example. So esports, basically very large audiences of people who aren't even playing games, they're watching other people play games. That's how engaging they are. I'd love to watch, I'd love to have a scenario where people are watching journalists write journalism. That'd be awesome. It's impressive to see what they're doing. All right, so what we use this engagement for is actually much more varied than people think. So usually when I say engagement 2, people expect the next answer to be entertain. Engagement to basically make money. And honestly, we do all kinds of other things with games. So my first example is inspire empathy. So we use games to inspire empathy. This is one of the penultimate examples of a social impact game. It's an early generation social impact game done for MTV. And the game is called Darfur is Dying. It's often cited, and very simply, what happens in this game is that you are in the middle of the crisis in Western Sudan, and you have to manage a family to meet basic needs like collecting water, and your threat is the Janjaweed militia, who can collect you at any time and then put you in a camp. And then Disney created a game called The Great Piggy Adventure, which is explicitly about trying to change the habits of young people, their shaving habits in particular. And then we know that we have games that are about practicing specific skill sets like flying a plane. Simulations do a great job of this. But we also have games that ask us to do critical questions, like what model of production perpetuates the device in our hands right now? It's phone storage, which I'll talk about a little more later. And we also, of course, have games that help us engage with news. And so Cutthroat Capitalism is another classic example. In Cutthroat Capitalism, basically it's an editorial perspective on Somali pirates that demonstrates the practical economics of pirating and why someone would want to become a pirate. So game content, which is surprising to people outside of the games community, is rarely as important as game experience. And if you want a very simple, off-the-top-of-my-head example of that, just think about the millions of zombie games in the world and the fact that only a few rise to the top. Their content may be zombies, but ultimately the experience is very different. Putting Plants Against Zombies is very different than other games. Okay, so I'm going to give you some explicit suggestions now that I've waxed philosophical for a little bit. So our first suggestion is actually designing the experience itself, understanding there are many varied ways to report the same content and engage your community. So part of our team gave a talk at the Game Developers Conference about 2 weeks ago, so this is fresh content. The largest conference of the games making audience is GDC, and we made some observations that I think are relevant here. For online dialogue, comments, forums, etc., we've had a lot of the folks that we've talked to say, well, this is one of the thorns in our side. We're having a really hard time managing our community. And so our first piece of advice is that one of the mistakes that many organizations, including those organizations, make is they apply the ban hammer. If someone is doing a bad job at commenting, you kick them out. And you say, okay, you're no longer a part of this community. That's not what we would suggest doing. Instead, we suggest something, in analogy, called a scalpel. And our suggestion for a scalpel is that you provide your moderators with specific tools that are precise, actionable, and effective. So give them the ability to make careful incisions instead of clunky, across-the-board decisions. And so this is important when you understand something we introduce as the dark triad. So this is the dark triad, and I'll explain it very simply. If you want to know where your trolls are coming from, they're coming from a perception that these 3 things are true. They believe their actions are impermanent, they believe there are no consequences to the actions that they create, and they also think that aggression is normal. If you can take one of these things out, you will succeed in disabling troll behavior. That is much better than taking a ban hammer to it, which just spreads your trolls elsewhere and encourages them to re-engage with your community and earn new ID. So we like these scalpels as an opportunity to try to affect either impermanence, lack of consequence, or the culture of aggression. And that's about giving moderators the appropriate tools. So while it seems tempting to say that logging in with Facebook will apply an identity and actually help people, or logging in with Twitter will help people address the dark triad, it really doesn't. And that's because it doesn't actually address the specific elements of impermanence, no consequence, or aggression being normal. And so I'll give you an example from rating system, or actually from games. So this is basically a user rating system used in the game to manage community and commenter behavior. So the community is almost self-managed. It's actually self-policing and articulating issues amongst certain players. And what's interesting about that is that that system can then feed things like timeouts, which is one of the most effective ways that communities like League of Legends actually affect negative chat. So when you have trolls, you just time them out and give them a break, and all of a sudden they stop being trolls, right? It's a little bit like some of the bad behavior of a child. Okay, so lesson 2 is about designing engaging news experiences. And one of our arguments here is based on something that's very common within the game design world, and that's this notion of flow. So the idea of flow is that when someone is in their optimal state, a flow state, they can perform well, they will be more engaged, and they'll want to stay. They lose track of time. Wouldn't it be great if they were reading your articles and just kept reading your articles, and 4.5 hours later they said, oh my gosh, I should have turned on the TV, or vice versa. So this is explicitly what flow is supposed to do. So I'll describe it in a little more detail. So if you're reading Sandra Boynton's moo, ba, la, 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 it requires a very little reading ability. It's a challenge for a toddler, but it's not necessarily a challenge for a mature adult, fully developed adult. And so the fully developed adult, after the 4th read, is bored. So they're in the blue section. They've got all the skill, but there's no real challenge for them. Unlike the toddler, who may see lots of challenge because all those words are new. Likewise, we can create anxiety. We can actually frustrate people, stress people out, etc., if we're asking for too much challenge up front. So if our language is too challenging for them, if the references, if our intensity is too much for them, they may withdraw because it is anxiety causing. And so your goal is, in flow in particular, is to balance the anxiety and the boredom, which is actually often a dynamic task. You're balancing it frequently by getting feedback from the user and then saying, wait a minute, okay, it looks like you're missing this part. Let me give you another opportunity to demonstrate that you understand it. Because we want them to land in their optimal balance and achieve flow. And this is basically the formal mechanisms from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, which is positive psychology, published more than 20 years ago at this point, but just getting favor within design communities. And within games, we actually have formal structures to do this. So we have difficulty staircases, or what some people call matriculation schedules, which are explicitly about giving the opportunity for players, audiences, to demonstrate an understanding before they're actually given more challenging activities. And large companies like Microsoft, or in this case Epic Games, shown here, hire psychologists to actually review large-scale player behavior data and actually map the bottlenecks within a level in order to affect the design. And they can do this both for real-time game releases, so a virtual world that's constantly being played with, and for timed releases. And they're always just looking for anxiety and boredom. Looks like people are kind of dwelling here. Maybe we need to give them new activity, etc. In the free-to-play marketplace, in the mobile marketplace, we often talk about whales, dolphins, and minnows. So minnows are players who come in, they're never going to spend more than at maximum $10 on a free-to-play game. Realistically, they may spend no money at all. And there are lots of people like that. Dolphins are the intermediary, and whales are the people who spend lots and lots of money on your game. They want to buy all the stuff that makes them better at the game, so they just keep plunking money, dollar after dollar down. And what's interesting about this, and important for people to understand, is that minnows make you popular, but whales make you money. That's the model that most free-to-play companies look at. They basically say, you know what, we got a lot of people, that's good. If we can get a couple of them, 10% of our population to pay for some stuff, we'll be happy. The other thing to know about game design is we use something called rubber banding fairly frequently. And we haven't seen this often applied within other interactive spaces. So basically, the way rubber banding works is it pulls two different players together for a shareable optimal experience. So if I have a lot of skill, I get to play with someone who has low skill, and the game handicaps us so that we can play together and feel good playing together. And it's very commonly used to create intergenerational play, because there are actually differences in the speed at which people can play, and also to bring novice and expert players together. So online and off, news structures and standards are relatively unchanged from what we're seeing. There are some, as I've heard some wonderful presentations today, some really great innovations occurring. And one of the things that we've noticed is that there generally seems to be an adaptation of existing models instead of the invention of new ones, or the response to existing opportunities, particularly in technology. So we've suggested things like, why not rubber band your audience? Why not actually think about ways to bring two disparate audiences? Many news organizations, for example, are talking about generational issues. Are there ways to bring those two generations back together so that they're actually having a dialogue instead of saying, I've got specifically targeted content for this audience and specifically targeted audience or experiences or content for those other audiences? Likewise, we suggest employing what we're sort of calling dynamic audience adjustments. And the way these work is that you use the feedback loop, the reader feedback loop itself, to make real-time adjustments. And I'll give you an example of something that we've got coming out of our lab that we've already tested. So this is Factitious. It's a very simple quiz-like game. And the way Factitious works is that users sort of log in, get a score, all this business. And what they're doing is they're evaluating news articles for 4 criteria. Is it a news article? Is it an advertising article? Is it an opinion article? Or is it entertainment? And so what we're doing is that big problem where we've got people on Facebook who are reading content and think it's true and can't tell the difference between an Onion article and reality. We're actually trying to both train them, but also train a system to identify that content so that we can flag it and help people understand what is being misunderstood. So this is what we call a human computation game within academic games. And the idea is that we're collecting data about people's perceptions as they play and feeding a system so that system can actually articulate it. And the other novel thing about this is, so Maggie Farley was our editor for the content here, and she was grabbing articles from the world. And so we've actually built a front-end system to make it very easy for journalists to just drop in content. So this isn't something that has to be programmed. It's not actually, it's a pretty open system. Okay. And the goal in Factitious was really to do 3 things. To answer questions around what readers are misunderstanding, finding out whether or not we collect data quickly and usefully to inform news organizations. We know that some organizations do things like trying to determine what's the biggest hit headline, what's going to get the most clicks, that sort of stuff. So we're trying to play with that, and also to help readers become better readers. All right, lesson 3. Look at that. We're doing great on time. So engagement is dynamic. And I'd like to unpack this a bit. So we understand that good teachers are dynamic, and we understand that good entertainers are dynamic. We also understand that games media is dynamic. And so this is a single plastic ball. By itself and untouched, it is generally uninteresting. Placed among others, it starts to take a life. There is dynamics amongst the balls, and new challenges, new opportunities that move through a flow channel, or could move us through a flow channel. We can juggle them, we can bounce them against each other, etc. And then add that human element, and we've got a person, and it's a far more variable and far more dynamic experience. And it's not just an experience for kids. It's evidenced by the U.S. National Building Museum's installation, The Beach, which is, again, a giant ball pit, but for adults and children. It sort of rubber bands it by its scale. It's actually big enough to fit many adults. So contemporary audiences, we find, want dynamic systems. And news is always a dynamic system. But what's interesting is that we don't always report it that way. News isn't always reported as a dynamic system. It almost sometimes sounds as though it is a structured system that doesn't change much. So dynamics in news have come in 3 ways traditionally. And we make this set of distinctions to help people understand what they're trying to create. So interactives, toys, and games are the 3 categories we often talk about within the lab and within the JOLT initiative. So this is a calculator, agreed? And this is an interactive. Interactives provide immediate feedback, but they aren't playful. And so an interactive might help you figure out what is better to rent or buy in terms of homes. Or it might give you an answer to something that is hard to figure out on your own. Or it may simply aesthetically engage and provide access to information that you go, wow, okay, it has more meaning. But interactives have few affordances for play. So I don't know if anyone remembers using a calculator, flipping it over to get hello. There's your play in a calculator. So this is a toy. gone from interactives to toys. And a toy supports play, it's dynamic, but it may lack goals. So if you think about the many toys in games, you have certain affordances that each toy offers. So a spinner emphasizes some randomness, dice emphasize randomness, you have a sense for control. Super Mario has a couple of affordances, right, left, jump, and Cars likewise. So every toy has different dynamics that are somewhat prescribed with our expectation of the toy and its behavior. So let's look at a news toy. This is a toy called September 12th. And as it reads, I won't read that whole thing to you, but the important notes here are, this is not a game, explicitly says it's not a game. You can't win, and you can't lose. Very typical for a toy. In this toy, the rules are very simple. Specifically, you can shoot, or you can choose not to shoot your missile. And you can see there are occasionally terrorists, so you fire your missile, because that's what people instinctively do, and you destroy a terrorist. But as you destroy that terrorist, the repercussion is you create more terrorists. You destroyed someone's home, they have means to be angry at you, you create more terrorists. Until there are more terrorists than anyone else. And that's the toy. That's the point of the toy. You can get the concept very quickly. And the idea here is that a toy lets you learn through play. That's the power of a toy. So I'm going to emphasize that again. A toy lets you learn through play. It's very different than a calculator or an interactive. So this is a game, right? We know games. And games structure play. So they add rules to the way we are going to play. So I have a ball is a toy. I say I have to hit it with a bat, it becomes baseball. I say I have to kick it, it becomes football or soccer. Games are basically interactive, but they're also playful and they contain goals. So here's a US game, a sort of news game called Budget Hero. And in Budget Hero, you have a series of calculators, interactives that become toys, and they let you balance the US budget in order to come up with your own formula. Sort of exposes some of the system for you. Likewise, this is a game, Monopoly. And Monopoly was specifically designed to demonstrate the theories of something called Georgist economics. The game itself was created to help us understand the argument against landlording, and it was originally called the Landlord Game, and against land barons, as they're sort of a contemporary threat at the time in the United States. And so that game itself was Lizzie Maggie's experiential editorial. When she designed this thing, she said, there's no way people are going to get this. I could write 100 more essays. If I design a game, by the time they're done playing this game, and it takes a while to play Monopoly, if you haven't played Monopoly, they will understand why this practice is bad. So interactive toys and games can all be engaging. But I'm here to talk about games, so I'll talk about games. And I'd like to give you a little storytelling 101 from the game's perspective. And this is where I basically emphasize that the most engaging story is your story. If you ask players, the thing that they like is the story that they can own as their own. So whether it's what you did to investigate a crime in a game like L.A. Noire, or the number of people you saved from invading hordes of zombies, or the city you built in SimCity Social, or the empire you built on this British version on Park Lane of Monopoly. Game players always say the same thing. They say, I built that world in Minecraft. They say, I crushed those candies, or I saved the princess, or in this case, almost saved the princess. So it's important to remember that these stories don't have to be epic. They don't have to be grand stories. They just have to be stories that are ours, stories that we feel we can own. And so a good example is Dan Archer's Ferguson Firsthand. Basically a news interactive about the Michael Brown shooting in the US that provides access to the eyewitness accounts and provides a dynamic experience. And Ferguson Firsthand is only embellished and made better by the opportunity to see it in VR, to actually see the images as they would have been perceived by someone who was a witness during this event. So that's a good example. Another example that's a bit more on the abstracted side is a game called Unmanned. And I'm a big fan of Mo Industria's work, which is very editorial. And in Unmanned, what happens is you are a drone pilot, and you are playing the game perpetually with these two panels that you're managing. And so the panel in this case is the target you were about to destroy with your drone, and then you yourself in your comfy suburban home managing your drone. And this game is perpetually struggling with the balance of everyday life and the horrific things that drone pilots have to do in the real world. And so these panels let you split those up. And it emphasizes the analogy between drone warfare and contemporary gameplay. And so you have moments where the game itself references other games and says things like, this game is so much better than Contemporary Warfare #2. And you have these moments where you, like this child, are sort of eye-opening, uncomfortable. And that's what this editorial style game does very well. It's enticing. But games are really good at helping us make other people's stories our own stories. We start to say, as I said before, I did that, even though someone constructed it for me. So it's basically stories like the Haiti earthquake. These stories might be the Haiti earthquake survivors, the journalist, and the worker, right? So I like this as giving us 3 different examples of the same event. Or the story of being a Syrian refugee from BBC. But ultimately, the most important thing, as I've emphasized before, is that games are about doing, because we as players do. So if we return to the example of Phone Story, which I promised I would come back to, a game that Apple actually banned from their App Store because of its editorial content. And it obviously, in a second, you'll see why it didn't resonate with Apple, if you're not familiar with it already. The short version is that what we do in Phone Story is not good. We enforce slave labor in the mining of materials, that first screenshot. We catch Chinese workers who'd rather die than continue their jobs. And we help hazardous waste electronics recyclers risk their health. Right? That's what we do in this game. But the brilliance is in that when we're doing it on our iPhones. And we are indirectly supporting the activities merely by playing the same device that supports this cycle of human abuse. So in games, we don't just read the story, we do the story. And I like that phrase, we do the story. And because games are dynamic systems, we're actually constructing systems that people are playing, we have a change there as well. So this is a game called the redistricting game, and in the redistricting game, it basically lets us play the system to understand the consequences of redistricting voters and manipulating the system in order to meet our own political agendas. And then Sweatshop takes aim at the world of low-cost clothing. Basically what happens is we are at once enforcing the system of low-cost production so we can get our score nice and high. And we're operating at a distance. We're always just managing the system to improve our performance. But we are also keenly aware of what we are doing to people when we are manipulating the system. And so it does have a very strong editorial basis. So remember that games are systems and that the story is in the system itself. When you're designing these virtual worlds that are actually very systems-based, the idea is the story is in the system. And that's been something that's been very resonant for us in our design work. So we know that games are engaging, and as a result of being in these systems, we find them engaging because we want to solve the problems that they present to us. But they also help us understand. So games help us understand the world in a few ways. This is a game we did not too long ago called Delivery Drone. And in our game Delivery Drone, instead of telling people about the challenge of privacy and convenience in the use of domestic drones to both deliver packages and occasionally spy on people, is that we let people experience it for themselves. So they attempt to deliver these packages with their drone, never flying over backyards or pools. And the game is very difficult, and that difficulty makes our editorial point, which is that there's a very thin line between this privacy and this convenience issue. And so we have very little content, what you consider facts, in this game. This game is totally fictionalized. But this type of game is not about delivering facts. What it's designed to do is inspire curiosity. Wait a minute, so what's actually happening with drones right now? We call these headliner experiences, and the idea is actually to lead players to traditional news content. We want to give them something that's enticing enough that they say, great, I want to go. Not too far with what people are doing with very short Facebook videos, for example. And these headline experiences are really just about enticing people towards the actual facts. So here's a more general example. Papers, Please offers no content that actually can be carried into the non-game world. Papers, Please is entirely fictive. So in this game, if you're not familiar with it, basically you're a border crossing guard and you've got to basically evaluate every person who comes through to figure out whether or not they can come into the country. And if you make a mistake, they may end up being a terrorist and there may be big issues. You might have to split up families, you may have to do all kinds of other things that are very disruptive. But the idea is that you're reviewing people's lives to determine who should or shouldn't be allowed into the country. What's interesting about this game is that people think differently about immigration after playing the game, and their consumption of immigration interest and news is affected. So likewise, our game News Park, which is about food and water consumption, it's a game our students created, our Joel Fellows created, and showed at the museum in Washington, D.C., is that the game is designed to facilitate a conversation that carries beyond the 10 minutes it takes to play this little card game. And the card game itself is just about starting a conversation and creating a thirst for knowledge about water consumption. Notice that pun there. And so what we do is we set up an experience to entice, deliver a single nugget or observation or an epiphany, something that they're going to carry with them after the game. And then in this case, it's about how much water it takes to make many of the common foods that we eat on a daily basis. And that creates our seed. Right? So News Park functions as a seed, an experience that then carries on later. And that seed experience is about embedding critical thought and inspiring a thirst for more knowledge. The seed experience grows, we hope. What we're seeing so far is that it seems to be working. And the phrase that sort of tossing around these days, the idea is a tree is thirstier than a seed. So if we can cultivate enough interest demands that they grow into trees, then they become more active news consumers. So the other note about these seeds and trees is this idea that short experiences invite new people, but long experiences appeal to the committed. So there's been a mistake in previous news games to make these really big news games that are supposed to compete with what we call AAA games, big console games. And ultimately, those people who choose to play long experiences are often about committing to something they've already committed to. So the difference is between a 15-second public service announcement versus an hour-and-a-half documentary. If you know nothing about the topic, you might want to see that 15-second PSA first before you get into the hour-and-a-half documentary and commit yourself to it. And so as an example, this game, This War of Mine is the name of the game, depicts the civilian experience of war, and it's basically inspired by the 90s Bosnian War. And it's a long experience comparatively to other games of its sort. And if you have no interest in a game about the civilian experience of war, then you're far less likely to play this game. It's that simple. Compared to something like September 12th, which is seconds, you get your point, you go on, and you're done. So games and play experiences don't have to be big. It's one of the things that seems to be a misnomer many times that we're working with external clients, including people in the news industry, but all the clients that we work with. And at this point, it probably makes sense for me to go right into my finishing case study. And the finishing case study is very simple. I love using this one. So this is Angry Birds. Billed as the #1 app of all time. And it had more than 200 monthly users at its prime, and it's even going to have a major motion picture. And when people think about games, they think about things like Angry Birds, and they say, aha, that's what's so cool about games, all these overnight successes, right? And ultimately, if you look at the history of Rovio, the company that created Angry Birds, they had to make 51 bad games before they hit their big win. And there's often this misunderstanding about the way that games and other successes occur. But I have to tell you, game success formula is often about failing quickly and failing often. You get a minimally viable product, you put it in front of a couple of people, you figure out whether or not it's engaging, pull out the right part of the system that's engaging, and then embellish that, make that better. So we learn a lot from our feedback loop. And I've got to say, and I really strongly believe this, that we learn far more from our mistakes than we do our successes. It's really scary when you find out you've got a success, because now you've got to figure out what part of it succeeded. And we actually have specific game design models that follow this rhetoric. So Tracy Fullerton's play-centric design is about basically getting as little testable game as possible out, formalizing your ideas, and then iterating over those as quickly as possible to figure out what specific kernels are the ones you want to use to make the game succeed. And great games are always the result of iteration. It's a very iterative culture in game making. And game designers often approach each solution as a new solution, which we've seen seems to be a little unique to some designers. So even though I may have made 3 other RPGs, here's what I'm going to do differently this time. I'm going to start from scratch and think about what's been going well in RPGs, role-playing games, and what's been going poorly in role-playing games. And game designers typically respond to the force of the outside world. So cross-pollination is pretty common for us. And it's cross-media pollination, so great movie comes out, someone says, wow, I wish we had a game of that. Great book comes out, let me convert that book to a game, and vice versa. But I have to be honest, our formula is often tireless failure. It's high energy, let me try it again, I know I can do this, I know I can do this. We also embrace ambiguity and explicitly explore it, which is something that seems that's sometimes unique to our industry. So we come in knowing that it's an uncharted space, and sure, my formula worked last year, but I'm not sure my formula is going to work this year. Let's go for it. And then finally, interview, under 45 minutes. Lesson 1, this is when you take that picture if you need it. Content may be king, but experience is the kingdom. This is good because it opens me up to, gee, these are broad sweeping statements. Can you expand? Lesson 2, design engaging news experiences. And I unpacked engagement for you a bit. And lesson 3, engagement is dynamic. So static approaches to engagement are dissipating. There just are fewer effective modes to doing this. And we actually work with museums as well. Being in Washington, D.C., it's very easy to work with museums. We run one of the biggest events for the Smithsonian American Art Museum, for example. We'll help run with some of our partners. And it's clear museums are dealing with this struggle too. They need more dynamic experiences. And then lesson 4 is to fail quickly and fail often, which we've embraced for years. All right, that's all I have. Thank you. I know I'm in between an alcohol social and I'm at the end of the day, but I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to answer them. There's a lot of content, not a lot of time. That's all I can move. Yes? Just need the mic.
So what would your advice be to publishers who want to experiment or start thinking about gameplay, knowing that we're never going to be able to actually devote real time and resources to it?
Yep. So one of the short versions on getting yourself a minimally viable product really quickly is actually to do a game jam or a hackathon. They're really great at ideation, and one of the things that I do with a lot of my clients is I will, at the beginning, make a version of the game so they have something to critique, because the experience is what they're critiquing, and experience is very hard to articulate, especially if you're not in a design field. So having people get together and make, and this is not quite exploited, but some organizations do, is they say, we've got some problems, and we know you've got some solutions, so they sponsor hackathons, or they invite people into the room. And you'd be amazed, particularly in certain industries, how many people are just excited to say, wait, so Google, you're going to let me in your headquarters for a weekend to make something? Great. And I'm going to hang out with other people who have really great ideas? Cool. And then those end up being the kernel for your success. And you know, I'm just about to step down as vice president of the local game jam and just stay on board. But I'm not just saying that as someone from the local game jam, because honestly, the only challenge here is we've got a lot of game jams, a lot of hackathons in the world, and so there is almost there's like a big shouting match where everyone's like, hey, come over here for mine. But I do think they're really effective, even if it's just an internal one where you say, everybody, Friday is our day to just do crazy stuff. And we're just going to lock it in 8 hours, stop everything else you're doing, which I know is impractical, and do this instead. Yes? Oh.
Thank you. You mentioned VR. Oculus shipped last week. HTC is there. PlayStation is coming, and on one of your first slides, one of your fellow had a Samsung Gear VR. I wanted to know if you have watched some of the VR journalism product that's been published?
Yes.
And what do you think about it? Do you think there's going to be like overlap between the gaming experience and the immersive journalism that way?
Sure. So I actually purposely avoided talking about VR for a couple of reasons. I am not resolved on the potential in VR. And I'm going to say, I'll give you some context. I got my second grad degree from the place that invented one of the big VR systems, the K virtual reality system. And that was more than 10 years ago. And I also worked on, I actually made a VR game as a grad student and worked with some really early generation systems. And I'm not fully bullish on its potential, but I love projects like Dan Archer's, which is why I explicitly mentioned it. I love this Ferguson firsthand. I think it's a good application. There's plenty of potential. I was really excited to see Google Cardboard widely distributed. I think those activities are really great. There's a lot of technical hurdles we still need to get past, and some of those technical hurdles are also social hurdles. The awkwardness of holding this device in front of you, engaging with others, but not really, is different than some of the other things that we've seen succeed in the technical space that actually facilitate social interactions in ways that people are eager to have. So dispersed worlds where people are out in the world because we're all traveling and many of us are flying all over the place, but we can still reconnect with Facebook and Twitter, makes a lot of sense. I think VR still needs something like that in order to make it succeed. Jendo's not popular. Yes?
What would you say that news organizations can learn from game companies when it comes to user analytics? I mean, they're really sophisticated.
Yeah, so I think one of the smartest things that the large-scale game developers did, so the AAA developers, like the ones I mentioned, was when they started hiring psychologists, because they were trying to do psychometric work. They were trying to do work that required people to have a sense of education, have a sense of psychology, and have a sense of large user behavior. And so I think that was one of the better wide applications of interdisciplinary study. So it wasn't let's just hire a bunch of people who are really good level designers, which they've been doing for years. It's let's just forget the level designers for a minute, talk to psychologists, and then return to level designers. That's one of my favorite moves. Any other questions? All right. I think that's it. Thank you, guys.